Ancient Rome's most brutal and inhumane arena, spectacles that went too far. At sunrise, the Colosseum was already alive. A stone beast, waking up to feed. Its massive arches caught the first pale streaks of light, while yesterday's blood still clung to the travertine like a shadow that refused to be scrubbed away. Beneath the stands, vendors barked for attention, their baskets brimming with olives and watered wine, ready for a crowd that hadn't even taken their seats but was already drunk on the anticipation of violence. Beyond the iron gates, handlers shoved half-starved predators into place, lions with ribs jutting through their fur like the hull of a wrecked ship, elephants stamping in rage, and panthers raking their claws against the bars until the wood splintered. From the tunnels came the sharp clang of swords. Not practice swings, but tests for the day's killing steel. The sound echoing off the damp walls of the hypogeum, and over it all, a low hum swelled into a roar, a vibration that could be felt in the teeth. Tens of thousands of Romans were pouring in, hungry for the thing their empire perfected better than anyone: death, dressed up as entertainment. Welcome to medieval spirits. Today, we are stepping into the sand to witness the forensic reality of the Roman arena. We will smell the copper tang of fresh blood mixing with the heavy perfume of saffron water sprayed to mask the stench of the dead. We will examine the engineering of cruelty, from the trapdoors that unleashed nightmares to the naval battles that turned the arena into a drowning pool. This is not the glory of Rome. This is its autopsy. The Roman arena wasn't just sport. It was a laboratory for cruelty, where the limits of human suffering were tested daily. Emperors flooded the sand to stage naval battles, starved wild animals to heighten suspense, and forced prisoners to act out myths that ended with very real, agonizing corpses. None of this was accidental. It was policy woven deep into Rome's machinery of control. A way to remind the mob who held the leash. Cheering from the stands wasn't harmless. It was loyalty shouted loud enough to echo through history. And today, we're stepping straight into that shadow. These are the most brutal, most inhumane arena acts that went too far, even for Rome. From blood-soaked funeral rites to executions dressed as theater, we'll uncover how an empire built its glory on turning suffering into applause. Before we dive in, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next descent into history's darkest corners. Now, take your seat. The gates are creaking open, and the first screams are already rising. The first gladiatorial combat in Rome didn't begin with golden fanfare or emperors in royal purple. It began in the quiet, desperate grief of a funeral. In 264 B.C., the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva chose not to honor their father with statues or prayers, but with the visceral spilling of blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and sent them to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market thick with the stench of dung and smoke, where the ground was already accustomed to the slaughter of beasts. This wasn't entertainment, it was duty, a munus, an obligation owed to the dead to feed the earth with vitality. Its roots stretched far beyond Rome, reaching back into the dark soil of Campania, where warriors were slain at graves to appease restless spirits who demanded companionship in the afterlife. Over time, killing shifted from a somber ritual to a spectator sport of high combat. The dead no longer demanded random victims. but duels between chosen men skilled in the art of dying. The Samnites, once Rome's bitter enemies, held such contests often, and Roman elites embraced the custom eagerly, seeing in it a reflection of their own martial virtues. Burying a man with treasures showed wealth, but burying him with a blood-drenched spectacle proved power over life itself. But funerals were only the beginning. The taste for blood, once acquired, is impossible to satiate. By the 3rd century B.C., Rome's leaders saw how these fights could do more than honor ancestors. They could steady the rocking boat of politics. Religious festivals, once solemn offerings to Jupiter, began featuring gladiators as the main attraction. The Senate framed it as piety, but the crowd knew the truth. It was state-sponsored violence designed to keep the people loyal and distracted. Even the armor told stories of conquest and subjugation. Early fighters wore the shapes of conquered foes, the Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with a curved blade, the Gaul with a broadsword. Watching them bleed was watching Rome's victories replayed slash after slash. A living history lesson written in scar tissue. Death became propaganda, and as blood spilled, the venues grew from temporary scaffolds to stone monuments. Temporary wooden stands gave way to permanent amphitheaters, temples to violence, where thousands gathered to worship the god of carnage. The games no longer belonged to grieving families. They belonged to the state, funded by taxes and the spoils of war. Each drop of blood whispered the same message Rome commanded men, armies, and even death itself. No one then could have guessed how far it would go, how the thirst would grow until it consumed the world. What started as ritual sacrifice morphed into theater, and duty became an obsession that bordered on madness. Rome had discovered a new weapon power over not just the living, but the meaning of dying. And once unleashed, it never closed that door. The crowd's roar wasn't reserved for men. Sometimes it thundered for beasts hauled from the farthest edges of the known world. Creatures that looked like monsters to the Roman eye. Lions from North Africa. Leopards from the Caucasus. Crocodiles from the Nile. Even giraffes dragged across scorching deserts. They weren't displayed as wonders of nature to be studied, but condemned as prey in a carnival of slaughter. Romans called these shows venationes, hunts, but there was no sport in it. They weren't about survival, but about domination. Proof the empire could trap the wild and destroy it for pleasure. Julius Caesar set the tone in 46b. C. Parading a giraffe. The first ever seen in Europe. A creature so alien it silenced the crowd. They called it a camelopard, half camel, half leopard, because Rome had no name for such a gentle giant. It didn't matter what it was called. The animal wasn't admired for its grace. It was thrown into the sand to be torn apart, its long neck offering no defense against the lions. The message was unmistakable. If Rome could seize the strangest beasts alive, it could conquer anything, anywhere. The slaughter only grew as the empire expanded, turning nature into a resource to be consumed. When the Colosseum opened in A.D. Dabbler, 80, Emperor Titus reportedly oversaw the deaths of more than 9,000 animals in one festival. A holocaust of fur and feathers. Archaeologists have found bones etched with marks of deliberate starvation, forensic proof of the cruelty evidence that lions and bears were weakened beforehand, their bellies empty for days, to ensure a quick, bloody kill when they were finally unleashed. Even elephants, once the terror of Roman legions under Hannibal, were herded into the arena and butchered for cheers. Their trumpeting cries of distress drowned out by the applause. Behind the scenes, logistics were part of the theater, a massive operation of capture and transport. Exotic creatures had to be trapped, hauled across deserts, kept alive just long enough to meet their doom in a city they could not comprehend. Caravans dragged chains through scorching sands, delivering victims to a city that demanded fresh blood with every sunrise. Caravans dragged cages across deserts. Fleets floated them down the Nile. And handlers risked their lives just to deliver living trophies to Rome. Seeing a panther in the wild was dangerous enough, a rare glimpse of primal power. Watching one explode from a cage in front of 50,000 screaming spectators, that was power made visible, packaged and sold. Every creature was a living souvenir of conquest, a breathing map of the Empire's reach. Proof that the Empire's reach knew no limits, that no forest or desert was safe from the Roman eagle. Some emperors made these hunts their own private stages, blurring the line between hunter and god. Commodus, Rome's most flamboyant showman, strode into the arena dressed as Hercules, wearing the skin of a lion. He slaughtered hundreds of animals himself, decapitating ostriches with special crescent-headed arrows to show off his aim. He wanted to look like a god among beasts, the master of the natural world. But everyone could see the truth, a fragile ego with a bow, killing animals that had no chance to fight back. The hunts were often rigged, the game fixed before it began. Animals were chained, maimed, or half-starved so the emperor could bask in a guaranteed victory without risk. And the people, they cheered, not because they admired him, but because when the emperor hunts, silence could be fatal. Behind the cheers, a quieter tragedy unfolded, one of ecological collapse. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder warned how rare species vanished from their homelands after decades of Roman slaughter. Lions were wiped out from parts of North Africa. Leopards disappeared from the Near East. And even elephants were pushed toward extinction to feed the empire's appetite for spectacle. The Colosseum wasn't just a theater of death, it was an ecological wrecking ball that reshaped the biodiversity of the Mediterranean. But for Rome, extinction didn't matter. The future was infinite. What mattered was the illusion that nature itself could be captured, starved, and destroyed for fun. Every carcass on the sand was another brick in the wall of imperial control. When you picture a gladiator, you might imagine two evenly matched warriors locked in noble combat. A fair fight. The reality was far more twisted and cynical. Rome thrived on imbalance, on contests engineered for cruelty and inevitable defeat. They built bizarre weapons, imposed absurd rules, and staged fights no one could truly win. Some victims weren't fighters at all. They were fodder. Prisoners and condemned criminals were shoved into the arena dressed as clowns or mythological figures, handed wooden swords, and sent to die against seasoned killers in full armor. The crowd jeered as the doomed flailed and fell. Their terror transformed into comedy. Public execution neatly disguised as sport, washing the blood from the hands of the state. Even the weapons became characters in this grim play. The retiarius fought with a fisherman's net and trident, a light and agile fighter, squaring off against the secutor, whose smooth, rounded helmet was designed to deflect the net but restricted his vision and breath. It wasn't pure skill, it was asymmetric warfare. It was suspense, a living riddle of whether the net would ensnare or the sword would break through the flesh. Romans devoured that tension, even when the match was as scripted as a stage play. The numbers grew more obscene as the emperors tried to outdo one another. Sometimes one gladiator was thrown against several foes, a desperate last stand. Other days, entire units clashed like miniature armies, turning the arena floor into a swamp of blood, splintered shields, and mangled corpses. And when novelty wore thin, they reached further into the taboo. Female gladiators, gladiatrices, stepped onto the sand in the 1st century A.D., defying gender norms for the sake of entertainment. Writers like Juvenal mocked them, calling them abominations. Yet records prove they fought for real against dwarfs, against beasts, even against each other. Their presence blurred gender lines but reinforced a darker truth. Everyone was meat for the machine. No one, man or woman, was beyond Rome's hunger for spectacle. Even the helmets were weapons of torment, designed to dehumanize. Some narrowed vision to a slit or muffled sound, forcing fighters to stumble half-blind while the audience roared with laughter at their confusion. Others were so heavy that raising one's head became a contest all its own, a strain on the neck muscles that became agony. Armor wasn't always protection. Sometimes it was punishment, a cage of bronze and leather. And then came the propaganda plays, the rewriting of history. Gladiators dressed as barbarians, forced to mimic Rome's defeated enemies in historic battles. Their inevitable loss reminded everyone that the empire always prevailed. That resistance was futile. Every mismatch, every exotic twist, every gender-bending stunt was carefully designed to keep crowds shocked, obedient, and begging for more. The Colosseum never settled for repetition. Boredom was the true enemy. It invented new cruelties, always hunting for the next thrill. By midday, once the morning duels had soaked the sand and the crowd started to fidget in the heat, the arena shifted gears. Combat gave way to theater with death at center stage. Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. For the condemned, it wasn't a trial, it was a sentencing. It was a script they had no power to refuse, written by the state. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war, they all became unwilling actors in an execution disguised as myth. Each victim's punishment matched their crime, a poetic justice written in gore. Thieves torn apart by wolves, arsonists burned alive, traitors thrown to lions. Every scene was a morality play written in real blood, and the scale could stagger belief. During Emperor Trajan's celebrations after his Dacian victory, thousands of captives were slaughtered over 103 relentless days. It wasn't random carnage, it was a factory of death. It was organized, paced like acts in a grim drama. with intermissions for cleaning the sand. Every death crafted to keep the audience on edge until the next horror arrived. Animals were the stars of this nightmare, their instincts weaponized. Lions were starved to a frenzy before release, their hunger turning them into biological machines of destruction. Bears chained in pits were goaded into sudden fury with hot irons. Even prized leopards were unleashed on trembling victims who were tied to stakes. The uncertainty, would the beast strike fast or toy with its prey, kept the stands howling for more. Sometimes the cruelty came dressed as legend. A perversion of culture. Prisoners were forced to play doomed heroes from Greek mythology. Orpheus torn apart by wild beasts while trying to charm them. Prometheus chained to a rock as vultures circled overhead to eat his liver. These weren't stories anymore. They were snuff films performed live. They were blood-soaked performances, and the sand was their stage. Death in Rome wasn't always just death. It was art. Sometimes it was theater. Bloody, mocking theater that stripped the victim of dignity. For the condemned, it wasn't enough to perish. They had to entertain. They had to perform their demise, acting out Rome's myths with their own bodies until the final, fatal curtain call. Executions became grotesque plays where flesh replaced masks, and the script always ended in agony. The cruelty stretched far beyond wild beasts to the very elements themselves. Crucifixion, borrowed from the East as a punishment for slaves, was staged right inside the arena. Men and women were nailed to timber while vendors hawked wine and children played nearby, desensitized to the screams. Fire joined the spectacle too, purifying and destroying. Prisoners were forced into the tunica molesta, a shirt soaked in pitch and resin, then set ablaze. Human torches writhing as thick, black smoke curled into the sky, filling the arena with the smell of roasting meat. As Tertullian bitterly wrote, they were living torches, illuminating the darkness of the Roman soul. These killings weren't just morbid entertainment, they were warnings. They were propaganda warnings carved in living flesh, defy Rome. And you would die slowly with tens of thousands watching. Not everyone could stomach it. Some looked away. Seneca complained that midday executions hardened the soul, making men crueler as they watched, stripping away their humanity layer by layer. But his protest drowned in the thunder of a crowd that came not for justice, but for the thrill of punishment. Rome's imagination didn't stop with sand and swords. It wanted to conquer the water too. Sometimes emperors demanded oceans inside the city. Mock naval battles, naumachie, were spectacles on an insane scale where water itself became a weapon. Julius Caesar set the precedent in 46 B.C., digging an enormous basin near the Tiber, filling it with water and real ships. Thousands of doomed captives were shoved aboard and told to fight as rival fleets, recreating famous sea battles. They weren't actors. They were dead men, walking. They were men condemned to die for applause, rowing toward their own destruction. Arrows, catapults, and steel turned the basin into a slaughterhouse afloat, the water turning pink with blood. Augustus expanded the madness to prove his might. In 2b. C. He created a basin almost 2,000 by 1,200 Roman feet, fed by a custom aqueduct, the Aqua Alsietina, just to keep it full. 30 warships clashed there, each crammed with prisoners, fated never to leave alive. The message Rome could command seas where none existed, even nature bent to imperial whim. By 52 A.D., Claudius went further, draining Lake Fucino to stage another Naumachia. When the captives greeted him with the chilling salute, Morituri te salutant, those who are about to die salute you, history gained one of its most haunting lines. Whether rehearsed or desperate, it summed up the hopelessness of men made into props. Fire, too, had its macabre myths, turning tragedy into farce. Victims wearing the pitch-soaked tunic were cast as heroes meeting fiery fates. Hercules, consumed by the poison of the Hydra. Or Mucius Scaeva, testing loyalty by holding his hand to the flames until it charred. The crowd laughed as these heroes screamed, their bravery reduced to ash. Their stories turned to mockery. Even the Colosseum's architecture fed Rome's appetite for domination. The building itself was a weapon. Under Titus and later Domitian, engineers built channels beneath the arena, allowing the sand to flood for smaller naval shows, then drain for combat the next day. Cruelty became an engineering project, a triumph of hydraulics. Water, fire, flesh, everything was a prop in Rome's theater of control. To drown captives, to turn bodies into living torches, to bend myths into slaughter that was power. The emperors weren't satisfied ruling men. They posed as rulers of the elements themselves. By the late 1st century, executions weren't punishments anymore. They were art forms. They were scripts dripping with creative malice, twisting cultural legends into tools of humiliation. Take the games inaugurating the Colosseum in A.D. 80, a festival of blood. The poet Martial recorded an actor cast as Orpheus, the musician who tamed beasts with song. In myth, animals sat enchanted by his lyre, peaceful and calm. In the arena, a bear was released mid-performance and mauled the singer to death while he played. Art turned to parody, beauty, to butchery. Another victim was forced to play Daedalus, the inventor who escaped Crete on wax and wings, suspended on a crude contraption meant to mimic flight. He soared briefly before the ropes were cut, plunging him to the beasts below. Martial quipped, "The man must have wished for real feathers, a poet's jest, hiding a man's terror at the crushing impact." Perhaps the most grotesque of all, the myth of Pasiphae, cursed to desire a bull. One show staged her infamous union with a mechanical beast, followed by a killing that blurred execution, humiliation, and pornography. A warning about hubris became public degradation. The message was clear. Rome owned its myths just as it owned its people. Heroes, villains, kings, queens. None were safe from being rewritten as props in a pageant of death. For spectators, these scenes were sideshows between serious contests, fillers to pass the time. For the condemned, they were agonizing ends. Dressed in costumes, a final indignity. For Rome, they were propaganda made flesh, proving the state could even rewrite the meaning of its own legends. In the Colosseum, stories weren't told with ink or marble. They were branded into skin, burned into bone, and applauded until silence swallowed the sand. The line between rule and raw obsession blurred until an emperor's whim decided who lived, who died, and how. Caligula, infamous for his savage moods, once ran out of animals mid-show and casually ordered spectators dragged from the stands to fill the gap. They came to watch bloodshed, only to become part of it, their screams indistinguishable from the actors. Nero, addicted to his own image, treated the arena as a personal stage for his delusions. Prisoners were dressed as tragic heroes from plays, then executed in ways that mirrored their scripted fates. Nero called it art. Rome whispered, madness, but quietly, for fear of joining the cast. And then came Commodus, the ultimate showman emperor, who blurred the line between king and gladiator. Cloaked as Hercules, he stormed into the Colosseum with club and bow, slaughtering hundreds of animals crippled beforehand to guarantee applause. He even billed the treasury for his performances, bleeding the state dry while forcing cheers from a terrified crowd. Not satisfied, he faced gladiators too, but only with every advantage rigged in his favor. His opponents used dull weapons while he used sharp steel. Losing was impossible. Clapping was compulsory, on pain of death. Domitian wielded the arena like a weapon of paranoia, a tool of psychological warfare. He staged midnight hunts by torchlight to keep Rome uneasy, unsure when amusement might turn to terror, the shadows flickering like demons. Even good emperors weren't immune to the lure of the games. Trajan, remembered as just and capable, marked victory with 103 days of games, thousands of deaths folded into a celebration of power, a river of blood to water the empire. Spectacle fed egos, but it carried a price. The mob is a fickle beast. Caligula and Commodus both died violently, assassinated by those close to them, remembered not for statecraft, but for theater written in blood. The arena that lifted them up also exposed their madness, amplifying their flaws for all to see. Not every Roman cheered. There were voices of dissent. Philosophers, poets, early Christians left a quieter record, one that saw rot beneath the marble. Seneca confessed the midday executions hardened him, stripping away empathy rather than purifying the soul, leaving him hollow. Violence, he warned, seeped past the arena walls, poisoning daily life until cruelty became mundane. Cicero, decades before, praised bravery, yet condemned cruelty for cruelty's sake, though even he admitted the mob demanded games as proof of generosity. To govern meant feeding the beast, regardless of the moral cost. For Christians, the amphitheater was both persecution and proof of their faith. Those who refused to renounce their faith were thrown to lions or burned alive, their deaths twisted into mass entertainment. Tertullian called the shows seeds of cruelty, indicting an empire that cheered injustice as sport. Economically, the games devoured fortunes, draining the treasury. By late empire, rulers bankrupted themselves, chasing spectacles grand enough to outshine predecessors. What once flaunted strength became an act of desperation, a golden curtain hiding a rotting stage. Culturally, The appetite dulled Rome's edge, making them soft. Citizens who once honored discipline now demanded cheap bread and endless circuses. Juvenal mocked this hunger with the phrase panem et circenses. To him, the craving for spectacle betrayed how far Rome had drifted from its republican roots. As frontiers cracked and funds dried up, the arenas crumbled along with the borders. By the 5th century, the Colosseum, still colossal, stood hollow, its sand silent, its roars gone forever. But the moral questions never faded. They linger like ghosts. Could a society that trained its people to revel in suffering truly endure history's verdict suggests otherwise. Today, the Colosseum looms, scarred but proud, a skeleton of an empire. Walk its tunnels and you might still hear echoes, iron clashing, beasts roaring, 50,000 voices rising as one in a chant for death. The stone is easy to admire. The engineering is brilliant. Harder and more honest is to remember its purpose, a machine for death. Cruelty rehearsed until it felt normal, accepted, even celebrated. Rome's arenas weren't merely about blood. They were about power. They were about control, shaping how citizens thought, laughed, and obeyed. Every hunt, every execution, every myth, reborn in screams, served the same end, to make power look eternal and absolute. And that is the warning carved into the ruins, legible to those who look closely. A civilization that glorifies violence eventually crumbles beneath its own applause. So tell us, which of these spectacles, the hunts, the living torches, or the emperors drunk on their own shows, best reveals Rome's darkest soul? Drop your thoughts below. And if this dive into Rome's brutal entertainments gripped you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into history's shadows. Until then, remember, the Colosseum may be quiet now, but its echoes of cruelty still breathe through the stones. If you want to explore more topics on history and uncover the untold stories of the past with medieval spirits, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more insights.